On the previous slide of this presentation, you downloaded a document that shows an assignment that fourth graders were asked to complete. So these fourth grade students were asked to write an opinion piece about their opinion about whether or not their school should require uniforms. And you also saw a rubric. So the rubric includes what we call evaluation criteria, or how the teacher is going to assess whether or not students have met the intended outcomes of that assignment. So the evaluation criteria for this particular opinion piece includes several things. For example, students need to be able to write an introduction as well as a conclusion. They need to be able to support their opinion with 3 reasons and details. And they also need to organize their thoughts into cohesive paragraphs, as well as use linking phrases or transitions to shift from paragraph to paragraph in a natural way. So let's look at the evaluation criteria a little bit more carefully. So this is something that the teacher made up because this is a classroom assessment and not a standardized assessment. So the justification criteria for this essay is actually given the most weight because that's really the heart of an opinion writing piece, is being able to justify your opinion by giving reasons and details to support what that opinion is. So based on this 50-point essay, the justification piece, being able to give 3 reasons with supporting details, would be worth 15 points. So the introduction and the conclusion are both assigned 10 points because these are critical pieces to writing an opinion essay. You need to introduce your topic and then you need to wrap it up at the end. And those are of equal importance, so the teacher decided to give each of those criteria 10 points apiece. Then we also have the structure of the piece, and that's given 10 points. So there's no use in making a good argument if it doesn't have a clear structure that a reader is, if a reader can't understand what you're trying to say, that's a problem. So structure gets 10 points. So then we have linking phrases, and that's only assigned 5 points on the rubric just because, well, linking phrases are important. They're not as essential as the other components being assessed, so that's why linking phrases is only assigned 5 points on the rubric. So typically when teachers create evaluation criteria for an assessment, they need to determine what's considered proficient, and that's really up to the individual teacher. Some teachers might want to say that you have to achieve 90% or better on the assessment to be considered proficient. Other teachers say 80%. We tend to see 80% as being the most common. So if you, in terms of creating your own assignments in this class, if you want to say 80% is the proficient mark, that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, 80% is often what we choose as our proficiency mark when we are assigning tasks as professors at this university. So in the case of this particular opinion writing essay, students who score at 40 points or above, which is 80%, 40 divided by 50 is 80, right? 80%, are students that are considered proficient. So students that score below 40 points on this essay assignment would be considered students that may be in need of some remediation. All right, so in order to analyze data effectively, it's really helpful to organize your data into a table. So you're actually going to create a table like this for the purpose of the key assessment in this class, but I want to walk you through an example so you understand how a data table can be set up so you can answer questions about the data. Because the whole idea behind collecting data is to use it to inform our instruction and better serve the needs of our students. That's the whole point. So therefore, we need to be very intentional and careful about analyzing data. So for the purpose of this assessment, and this is a fake assessment, this does not convey real information about students. Somebody just made up this data table just for an exercise. But instead of putting students' names, we put students' numbers in this case because, again, they're not real students. So each student has his or her own row, and in each column you see all the different evaluation criteria that we just talked about and that you saw on the rubric that you downloaded at the beginning of this presentation. So, for example, the introduction has its own column, justification, which is another piece of the rubric, has another column, and so on. So every column has an evaluation criterion that appears in the rubric. And I know it's kind of hard to see the whole thing because my webcam's in the way, but know that the columns to the right say linking phrases and conclusion. I realize that they're kind of cut off by the webcam. But anyhow, so what the teacher did was, after scoring all of the students' essays, the teacher entered the number of points that students scored for each criterion on the rubric. So, for example, if we look at student number one scored 8 points out of a total of 10 points on the introduction. So the teacher entered 8 in the row for student 1 under the column for introduction. And likewise, for the justification piece of the rubric for the opinion writing piece, student 1 scored 7.5 points out of 15 points, so therefore the teacher entered 7.5 points in the column. So this is a little bit time intensive to enter all of the student scores for each criterion within a data table, but doing this and taking this step is actually very useful because it can yield a lot of information about how students performed on the assessment. So when you do your key assessment in this class, you're actually going to construct a data table like this. In order to analyze the data you will need to look at for part A of that key assessment. All right, so the reason why we've created a table like this is to look at where students performed well, because we want to know like what are they mastering, what are they proficient at, but we also want to look at, okay, what was hard for the students, where do they need help, where can I as a teacher determine areas where I need to provide additional instruction. So those are things that we want to think about. Which students are proficient, which students need help, and we also want to think about which items were especially difficult for students. And by items, I mean those criteria that we looked at on the rubric, like the ability to write an introduction and to write a conclusion and to justify your points with reasons and so on. So a lot of the time, it's easiest to answer these questions by doing some color coding. So here's the same data table again. So this time in the column furthest to the right, and I realize my webcam's cutting it off a little bit, but just so you can kind of see what it looks like, the teacher added a column for the total score for the students. So the teacher added up how the students did for each criterion, like introduction, justification, organization, and so forth, and determined the total score that students received for this opinion-based piece. So if we figure that out, like, right, if we go to student 1, 8 points and 7.5 plus 5 plus 4 plus 8, the total comes out to 32.5. At least I hope that's correct. I didn't actually do that myself. Anyway, so we'll go with it anyway. So this shows us how students performed. So highlighting or color coding students' total scores can be really useful in determining which students have achieved proficiency or mastery and which students need some help. So in this case, the teacher decided that she is going to highlight students who scored at the proficiency level, which again is 80%, or in this case 40 points or above on the essay, in green. So if we look at this data table, we can see that 1, 2, 3, 4 students demonstrated proficiency with this assessment, which suggests that the teacher may need to do some reteaching on the topic of writing an opinion-based essay. So then students who scored in the range between 30 points and 40 points, so roughly like a C/D level if we want to think about it in terms of letter grades, those students are highlighted in yellow. So those students had some areas of strength, but those students still have some areas where they need additional support. And in red, any student who scored under 30 points, which would be like a failing grade, indicates that this indicates that these learners need a lot more help with writing an opinion-based piece and require some extra support from the teacher. So what you see in red indicates students who definitely need some additional support because they scored under 30 points on this opinion-based piece. So what this does is it gives us an overall sense of where the class is at. So if this was a real class of students and I was a teacher, this would tell me, because I see a lot of yellows and I see a lot of reds, that my students need more help with writing opinion-based pieces. So there are some things that I probably need to go back and reteach in order to make sure that my students are proficient at this particular skill set. So this does tell us, which students get it, which students need some help, and which students need a lot of help. But by looking at this data table, it doesn't actually tell us which items are areas of concern. So in this case, we've highlighted that column furthest to the right. This is total, but now we need to do some more highlighting to look at particular items to see what students did well and where students could need some extra help. So what the teacher did here is the teacher, again, used that color coding system. So if students achieved mastery or a proficient level, the teacher highlighted the columns in green. So if the students are showing skills that are developing, like, in that C/D range, if we're thinking about letter grades, those are highlighted in yellow. And if students were struggling and would have received a failing grade on a particular item or on a particular criterion, they would be highlighted in red. So for example, like if we look at student 1, we're looking at this first row here, The students scored 8 out of 10 on the introduction. 8 out of 10 is 80%. So therefore the teacher highlighted this as green because the student demonstrates that he or she or they can write a proficient introduction. But if we look over at the next column, the justification, the student only received 7.5 points out of 15 points. So that's 50%. So the student has a partial understanding of how to justify his or her or their opinion in an opinion piece, but the student hasn't really mastered that skill, so therefore the teacher is highlighting it in yellow. And if students just miss something completely, like they really didn't get any points, the teacher highlighted it in red in this case. So this is really helpful because highlighting all of the particular items according to green, yellow, or red can help us identify which areas, where students did well and where they need extra support as a whole class. At a glance, it tells us a lot of information. So if we look at this, and I'm looking column by column, like if I look at the introduction column, I see some yellows. I see some students who demonstrate only a partial understanding of writing a good introduction, but I also see a lot of greens. So I might say that most of my students have demonstrated proficiency with writing an introduction, but there are a handful of students like student number 5 and student number 9, student number 13, and so on, who probably could benefit from some additional support, maybe an extra lesson or two taught in a different way, a re-engagement lesson, about the topic of writing a good introduction to begin an opinion-based essay. So then if I look at the justification column, so I'm looking down, I see that a few students are in green. So some students have demonstrated mastery. I don't think any student got all 15 points based on what I'm seeing. A lot of students scored 12 out of 15 points. So what this tells us is that there are a few students who are proficient with justifying their opinions with reasons and supporting details, but a lot of the class only got like 50% on that criterion for justification per our assignment rubric. So this tells me that justification is an area where the students probably need some additional lessons in order to re-engage them and to help them further develop this skill set. And likewise, if I look at organization and structure, it looks like that's an area where students need a lot of help. So the highest scores there in this organization structure column, there are a couple of students who scored 8s. No students got all 10 points. So that suggests that the class may need some extra help there. But most students scored yellow on that. So most students only got, half the points available for that particular item. So that tells the teacher, all right, my students need some additional instruction about how to effectively organize their essay. So I'm not going to go through every column, but you get the idea that by color coding all the particular items according to green to show proficiency, yellow to show partial understanding, and red to show little to no understanding, that gives you an overall picture of how students did on particular items. So as a teacher, I can look at this and I can know, okay, what do I need to reteach? Where do students need the most help, and so forth. So very helpful to do. And when you are analyzing your data set, when you work on the key assessment in this class, I strongly recommend that you do color coding like this. All right, so that concludes this presentation, and let me know if you have any questions about analyzing data. And next, what you're going to do is an activity to help you analyze or get some practice with analyzing data on your own.